we've gone through that, we'll do a Q&A where you can, I'll invite you on and you can either choose to turn your camera on or whatever, but you will unmute yourself, but that will be at the end. So that's the basic housekeeping. The other point is, because I'm going to be speaking, if you cannot have conversations in the chat at all, because it pops up and I get distracted, and then I'll lose my train of thought and it will all become a big mess. So if you can just restrain yourself from going into the chat, like I say, there will be an opportunity at the end where I will do a Q&A session. If I can't get the chance to speak to everyone, then you can either send me them or you can then pop them in the chat, and I'll obviously get the chat afterwards. It is recorded and it is transcribed, because then I can, it just helps with, I can put it onto YouTube privately, so that when I send you the replay, it can have, if it works, it can have all the subtitles on it as well. It's just, if there's any, if I drop any nuggets, I can pull it out of that as well. So yeah. Okay, so I'm going to get started. For those of you that don't know me or haven't been to one of my workshops yet, I'm Sarah Squires. My background, amongst other things, is child protection social work and family support, where I knew nothing about any of this, by the way. It wasn't until I had a personal experience in this that I fell into this world and realised the massive gaps that there are in training for professionals and in support for victims. And that kind of is where it all started about 10 years ago now. Just started with talking about it, doing YouTube videos and talking about it, and then like having one-to-one conversations with people and trying to understand. And what emerged from that was this pattern, particularly in the court arena, because I also run a therapy business as well, solely focused on narcissistic abuse and the co-parenting, for all of that side of it. But what I noticed for those that were going through the court process was there were lots of similarities in those cases, both in terms of the process, but also in that individual's way of presenting and the gaps in their own. You don't know what you don't know, and there's no way on earth you're going to know what's going to happen in family court beforehand, because it's just not something that's on the curriculum. Your head's in a mess anyway because of everything that you've been through. And so that was where kind of Get Court Ready was born out of, is wanting to show these patterns and provide you with tools to counter. I mean, we can't counter everything because there's a lot of variables within this, but I'm all about personal power. So I want to give you as many tools as possible to do your bit. You've all seen the Venn diagram of things that you can control, things that you can't. I want to focus on the bits that you can. And so that's kind of where I've come into this, from like my train of thought, my way of thinking. Like I say, background in social work, done counselling and coaching qualifications since then, and done lots and lots of research on these behaviours and everything. So today, though, we're going to be focusing on strategy. And I've called it Strategy Under Fire because if you think about like a game of chess, they're sat quietly, they're playing their pieces. There's a strategy involved in that, what piece they're going to move first, and then where they're going to go from there. They kind of got it mapped out in their head, but it's also dependent on the other person's moves as well, which might surprise them. But if you imagine chess whilst they're in a burning building, that's kind of a little bit more akin to where you are at, because you're not only having to think of the strategy that is going on within the court process, within the co-parenting or that kind of situation, you're also having to deal with all the grenades that are being sent over and the fire that's getting closer all the time. So I wanted to acknowledge the depth of that and why it's different. So that's why I call it Strategy Without Fire. So we're going to go through 4 sort of separate parts on this, and there are some resources that I can share with. Actually, I don't know if I'm going to share something in the chat. I don't actually, can I share it in the chat? Oh no, I can't. Sorry, I'm going to share a file with you in the chat, but I'll send it out afterwards. And it's a breakdown. It's like a worksheet that you can go through after, and it's based on like an elite strategy program for professionals. I'm a big football fan, and I look at how they perform and their strategy around games. And I've listened to Brené Brown talk about her work with elite athletes and elite SEOs, people at the top of their game, and their look at the way they deal with strategy. And so I adapted that. So I'm going to send that out to you. But this is what we're going to talk about, is like the meat and then and the general terms. And then this worksheet is something you can then go through to individualize it for your case. So I'm just going to take a walk, and the throat keeps getting a bit dry. Okay, so first part of this is we're going to look at what I've called read the room. So adapting your strategy to the players involved. And I appreciate that you've got a lot going on with this, and I certainly don't want to give you more work, but I do think it's important that I make this point, and I make it in all of my products, in all the resources that I provide, is you're dealing with different people, different professionals with different motivations, different policies, different internal motivations. And so, yes, you could have one big strategy, but actually, if you can nuance it to each individual person, you're more likely to speak their language, and you're more likely to get heard than having that overall. Again, I appreciate that might feel like, oh my God, I've got to do something bigger. Actually, once you've kind of understood it, it will become a bit more natural. So we're gonna talk about that for this first section. So I think that blanket strategy, which you'll find a lot of solicitors have, actually. So you might go to a solicitor who, might say they understand the dynamics that you're talking about, and I'm not here to slate any solicitors, but they will probably just have a blanket strategy. This is how I deal with these kind of high conflict cases, and they're not looking for any nuance within that. And that's why I want you to kind of take control of your own case and empower you with this information. Is that might work sometimes, but it's not going to work all the time, because like I say, the more nuanced you can get, the more likely you are to be heard, the more likely your strategy is going to be successful. Again, going back to the football analogy, you might have a way of playing, but you want to change it for each team that you play to meet, so you know what you're up against, you know how they're going to play. For those of you that don't follow football, I apologize. I will use that analogy quite a bit, but you can get the understanding of it. So let's first of all look at how you profile these professionals, so that you can then align your approach accordingly. So I'm just going to, oh no, okay, that's fine. So first off, let's start with the judge. So if you think about the judge, this person with all the power in the room, this person who, by the very nature of their name, is judging you, judging the case, judging your evidence, judging everything about this. And when you've come out of narcissistic abuse and been in that kind of relationship where you feel like constantly under that microscope because everything that you do could set them off, that is really triggering, that in and of itself. To a normal person, I remember once I had I got a speeding ticket, and for whatever reason I ended up having to go and into the court to explain that I'd forgotten to change my address on something, and it was terrifying. And I, it was small scale. It was nothing big. There weren't huge consequences or anything, but just being in front of people that were judging you as a person is terrifying. When you compound that with what you've been through and the what's at stake in these situations, then you've got to be aware of that within yourself. But let's think about the judge. So he commands respect. I think that's really important. is that it's a command. In my opinion, it's about deserving respect, but unfortunately for judges, it comes with the job. It comes with the title that they command respect. So imagine the persona of someone who, by very virtue of the role that they play in their work environment, commands respect. What does that do to their personality? What does that do to their interactions? They also, you know, that they're there for justice. You become a judge because you believe in justice. But justice looks different to everyone, doesn't it? You know, my idea of justice might be different to your idea of justice. You can look at what's going on the world stage at the moment. You know, the recent assassination. I'm not going to get into politics, by the way, but the recent assassination in America and the diverse opinions upon that shows that justice is not as black and white as we might think that it is. And we go into the system thinking it is going to be. And so being aware that there are all these layers to this person, and they obviously believe in the system that they're working in, but they also, I used to work in public child protection, and judges, the same judges, you know, that work on your cases will work in public cases as well. And I do think that has an impact, because I feel, and I'm not a judge, so I can't get into that completely into their mind, but I would imagine that, you know, if you've just had a case where you know, this child is living in abject poverty, you've got drug dealer parents, you've got, you know, knives being wielded in the house, you've got constant, you know, violent impacts, you know, all of that kind of environment. They've just listened to that case, and then and again, this is not me making judgment, I'm just putting myself in their mindset. Then you've got two sort of middle class parents coming in talking about contact arrangements. That is going to shift that, you know, you don't have to be a brain a mind reader to see that that's going to have an impact on how they view things. And so again, this is all just important for you to understand their profile. The other important thing is that the work that they do is so with delays and everything, they're churning through cases. You are just a case number to them. You are not, as awful as it sounds, you are not important to them. You're not really people. You're a number. You're a case. So they want you to get to the point. They don't want lots of words, lots of descriptions. They want quick, fast, almost like bullet point, so that they can get to the point and they can get through you, so they get on to the next one. Again, this is all wrong. I'm certainly not saying that any of this is right, but this is the case that we're living. So they are relying on that almost like first impression, that credibility, how you speak, your consistency, all of that is going to be so much more important when you're only with someone for that snapshot of time. So just be mindful when you're speaking to them that don't try not to over explain. Be concise, be respectful. And again, I'm not saying you don't know these things, but I think it's important to have that strategy. So when you're considering how am I going to go into this hearing, that is part of your strategy. When you're deciding what am I going to present and how am I going to present it, that is one separate individual strategy. Like one separate game of football, that stands up on its own. What you've then got is you've got CAFCAS, who are different. They work under the same umbrella, they are court appointed, but they've got a social work background. So their training, and my background is social work, so I speak with some authority on this, although my training was a good 15 years ago, 16 years ago. So I am a tad out of date with some of that. But theirs is all about protection. And so when they come in, they've often done years in that public law. So again, with the same thinking that a judge might have about, you know, the spectrum of cases, CAFCAS officers might come in with some of that. Although from speaking to a Kafka, a recently retired Kafka officer, he did say that they are taking on a lot newer social workers, but they still will have had to have done a lot of groundwork within public law to take that. So just again, just thinking when you're presenting to them, the way you present your risk, you need to be mindful, and also look at the guidance and the language that they use, which again will be different to the judge, and I'll come to that in the next section of this. But it's understanding that they have this background, so when they're coming in and working with you, that's their training, that's their understanding, that's the way they're viewing this case, is through that balance of court, family court, and contact and private. So that's really important word. This is private. This is about you as a parent in the court process, rather than the public, which is they've had to kind of shove themselves in it. And I know for some of you there might be crossover, you might have both public and private involvement, but I'm trying, just for ease, let's just separate them out slightly. So yeah, so for CAFCAS, when you think about those professionals, you are thinking about someone who is basically bridging those worlds between the child protection and the private family life element. So when you are presenting that evidence and you're building your strategy around working with CAFCAS, those are the things that you need to take into consideration. We are going to build on all this. This is all laying the platform, by the way. Social workers, this is sort of my background. So what I'm sharing with you is my own insecurities around my how I was as a social worker. Is we are rescuers. You know, I would say 100% of social workers are rescuers by nature, and by that what we mean is they play into that dynamic that your ex is very good at manipulating. You are a rescuer, and so there can be that clash, because again, speaking from my own experience, if I'm not rescuing, I don't know who I am, kind of thing. I'm working on that. But so when you think about working with CAFCAS, it's being aware that that's kind of their underlying motivation here, is they want to rescue, they want to fix. Also being aware that they are highly vulnerable to your ex, because they have the exact same core wounds. Not all of them, obviously, you know, not taking away individuality, but some of the core wounds you are going to share. So they're going to be equally as vulnerable as you were in that relationship, in falling for the love bombing, in falling for the victim act that they put on. And so again, it's being aware of how they are coming into this arena and that protection element. If you think about the drama triangle, if those of you that don't know the drama triangle, I definitely recommend you looking at this. You've got the three main characters of the abuser, the rescuer, and the victim. And obviously in family court, people dance around that based on the perspective that's being offered, the narrative that's being offered. When you introduce a social worker or a CAFCAS officer, they can often step into that rescue role, which then displaces you as the rescuer of your children, of yourself, but also it shifts the victim out. So it just, them coming into the triangle has a massive impact on the dynamic. So again, these are just important for you to understand how that happens. So the next thing we're going to talk about is recognizing when to lead, when to lean back, and when not to say anything at all. So when to lead, and this is the best way, again, if we look at a chessboard, for example, or you know, football is something I understand a little bit better than chess. Sometimes you make the first move. Sometimes you're on the offense, and that's powerful. You know, you're going forward, you're trying to score the goal. But what you want to know is, are you strong? So in transition, are you strong enough to make this attack, or does it leave you vulnerable at the back? And this is, again, for you, when you're thinking about your strategy, is if I'm going forward, if I'm going on the attack, and I don't mean literally, is that going to leave me vulnerable to a counterattack from the other person? So it's weighing up every time you're thinking about what you're going to present, where does that leave me vulnerable? So is this something I should be leaning into, or is it time that I just step away? So essentially, you're going to be faced with lots and lots of choices, because they are always, your ex is continuously going to be giving you lots of opportunities to collect evidence, to report them, to take action, to go on the attack. But some of their attacks are actually false, and they're designed to leave you vulnerable. They're designed to create an openness so that you fall into it, and then they can counterattack and score the goal, or take the win. So that is really important for you to be able to assess. And again, I understand how difficult that can be, which is in the last part we're going to talk about, why your own inner regulation is so important in these times. It's really important to know, when is it safe to lead? When am I best to go on the attack? When is it the right time? And I can't give you the answers in this of when that is. That's something for you to assess yourself. But it's weighing that up. Is this a strong attack, or is it leaving me open? And then the opposite of that, which is, when do I hold? When do I lean back? When do I hold? When do I defend, essentially? So when they're coming at you with all of this stuff, when should you just sit back and just take it and make a note of it and keep it as evidence, rather than leaving yourself vulnerable by falling into that counterattack, which, like I say, opens you up? And again, I think very much in football terms here, but when, if you play on the counterattack in football, you push everyone up and you leave your defense weakened. And that's what I'm talking about for you, is when you're thinking about weighing this up. If I was to go forward with this, if I was to call social services for this incident, how does that make me vulnerable? What is the opportunity for them to counterattack me on this? What is the narrative that could come out? And weighing that up against the opportunity. So how likely is it that you're going to score that goal? How likely is it that, if it's a really good chance, if you're one-on-one or you've got 5 members of your team going forward, that's a really good chance, and you're going to go for it, even if it might leave you a bit weak at the back. You're going to go for it. However, if you've got your weaker members of your team going forward, then you might not. You might choose to stay back. So if you were to go forward with that, in this example for social services, is it a strong enough call for you not to be totally vulnerable, i.e. the counter narrative? What are they going to say when you phone social services and say they've done X, Y, and Z? What's their counter narrative going to be? And is that going to be stronger than yours, or at least equal to? Is it going to diffuse? And therefore, are you going to be placed in a more vulnerable position? I hope that when I come to the Q&As, I hope that I hope that I've explained that okay. Again, I know not all of you will know football, but I hope that I've managed to sort of explain that. So, and so therefore, what you're left with, if you choose, to either lean back or to push forward, sometimes when is silence? When is, doing nothing? When is just not even responding to it? When is that the best time? Because there will be times, particularly when they make allegations, on text, when they tell you, little Charlie has told me that you shouted at them when they, wouldn't put their shoes on or something. If you go in, if you lean in and go for it, are you going to get anywhere? How's that gonna play out? Is it going to actually create more vulnerability? If you don't say anything, what's that going to do? And then it's finding what is the best. Is it best not to say? And, you know, in a lot of those cases, it is best to stay silent, because actually what they want is they want that back and forth. But I know a lot of parents struggle with that, because they think, well, if I don't say anything, people might think it's true. It's not really, you know, again, and this is weighing it up, and I can't say for all situations, but it is weighing up that, is it that big a deal? When I provide context, where does it fit within the bigger picture of our situation? And therefore, where do I go with this? What strategy is the best for me to take on this? And like I said, in a lot of cases, silence is the best response, because a lot of times they are just trying to wind you up. They're trying to pull you into a conversation. They're just baiting you for a response, because one, they're probably bored and they want something to do, and they think, oh, I know, I'll just wind them up for a bit, because that's sport to them. Equally, it might be a trap. So they're setting you up for something. It does depend. But again, the more you know, and the more you have the ability to assess each individual opportunity, each individual situation, as, do I go forward with this? Do I lean back? Do I say nothing? Then that's gonna, I'll come back to you, David, because I don't want to get into this. So when we do the Q&A, put your hand up then, or make a note right now of the question that you're going to ask, and then we'll come back to it. Okay, so next one is spotting the professionals when they're with aligned to the other parent or the other party. You'll see this a lot. You know, I don't need to go into detail on that. You know the signs, you know the feeling when someone's, you know, they're challenging everything you say, but they're letting the other person get away with saying whatever they want to do without question. You know how that happens. The difficulty is how do you shift that? And ultimately, this comes down to that strategy and understanding when do I say something? When do I speak up? Do I have to defend myself at everything that they say? Do I, you know, am I responding from that internal inner child hurt position? Or is this something that's going to move my case forward? Is this something that they're going to take on board? Now, again, you'll have had this experience. Sometimes you just can't get through to people. And the louder you shout, the more they shut down. And I use the ghost analogy. Apologies for those of you that have worked with me and been on these before. I use this all the time because it feels so relevant. If you've ever watched, you know, those thriller horror films where there's a ghost and someone sees the ghost and they say, I've seen a ghost, everyone tends to go, you're probably tired, you know, you maybe imagined it. They don't believe it. The more that person has those experiences and they go to them and say, no, really, seriously, I've seen the ghost, this is what they're doing. People start to question your mental health. They start to question you, and then you can get angry at them because, well, why don't you believe me? Why? It's not that. And it just escalates, and they don't believe you. They think that you're mad. They think that, you know, you're the problem. So what happens in those films is they only ever believe in the ghost when they see it for themselves. And that's how you shift their lens, is you stop trying to force them to see what they can't see at that moment in time because they're caught in the spell. You know, they're totally aligned with that parent. You've got to stay consistent in what you're showing, and showing it as child focused, showing it as, you know, in their language, showing it as not being conflict for the sake of conflict. You're not disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing. You know, you're doing it because of these reasons. Being able to just consistently, calmly show up, and when you follow that strategy and you understand their language, you can keep presenting in that way. You can keep presenting your evidence in that aligned way that will slowly but surely shift. And it shifts it for two reasons. Three. Number one, when they say, this is from a business perspective, but they say people have to hear the message at least 7 times in order to, you know, start taking it in, for it to sink in. And that doesn't mean I want you to keep, you know, counting and going one after the other, say the same thing 7 times in a row. What I mean is that consistency of showing up eventually will break how they think. It will naturally shift to a certain degree. When you consistently and calmly show up, what it does is it undermines the narrative that your ex has been telling them about you. They've been saying that you're angry, that you're emotionally unstable, all of the above. And when you show up calm and consistent, you're undermining that. And that, again, unconsciously will start to chip away at what they might have been aligned with, because actually you're not showing up at that person. So that doesn't make full sense anymore. And finally, the key one is your ex gets really angry, and the ghost starts to reveal itself, because they see they can't control you. They're losing control of this person. They're losing control of the professional, and they're losing control of the narrative, because you're not playing your part anymore. If we go back to the drama triangle, you're not playing your part anymore. So they start to dysregulate, and then they start to show their behavior. So that's the powerful way of doing that. But next, that leads nicely into the controlling the narrative without looking like you are controlling. And this is about know what they're working from, know what the professionals are working from. So go through the Kafka's website and understand how they assess for things. Whatever's relevant to your case, understand not just how they assess it, but the language that they use. So that when you're speaking to them, I'm not saying you parrot their words, but and I would say use a thesaurus, find out how they're describing, whatever your situation is, how they describe child abuse, use a thesaurus and present it in that way. Same with you, how you're presented, how your ex is describing you. Go through, use all the descriptive words, those adjectives, highlight them. And then what's the opposite of that? How do I present as that? How do I present as the opposite of that? And so the language is so important in these sorts of cases, because language bypasses so much. We know how much communication is not about necessarily the words, but how we say them and the meaning of them and all of that. So this is why it is really important. But go through, the court guidance, the welfare checklist, their policies on how they assess these kinds of cases. Start to really understand their language. What are they assessing for? How are they assessing it? And what language are they using to describe it? And then when you're putting your statements together and you're preparing for, to give verbal evidence or respond to anything in hearings or in meetings, use variations of their language so that you bypass the divide between you. So I talk about this in Transforming Your Alienation Story, but there's a gang culture of the judges are in a gang, Kafkas are in a gang, they're in one gang because, it's them versus you kind of thing, not completely, but it feels like that. And you're outside of that. Well, this is how you find that common ground. You're not going into their gang, but you're finding a common ground, because a shared language helps to make that connection. And so learn their guidance, structure your statements the way that they use that to describe. So if they're describing coercive control or alienating behaviors or emotional abuse, whatever it is, whatever individual element, use their guidance, and ask them to use their tools. So have they used the empathy scale, for example? They've got those tools, know them. So you can say, have you used that one? You're telling them what to do, but you can ask the question. And then, when you get to cross-examination, you can ask, well, why wasn't that used? Child impact assessment framework, for example. These are all learning all of that. So the next bit is the power of suggestion over instruction. I talk about this again with most people, that you're driven by this need to tell everything, to paint the whole story, to give them your, the entire version of events. They don't want that, and they don't need that. They don't want it because it's too much. It's too much for you. Yeah, let alone for them. They kind of just want like Polaroid snaps, essentially, as opposed to like a full video of everything. They just want snapshots of it. And so you want to make sure that those Polaroids, those snapshots, are building blocks. So think of it like Hansel and Gretel. You're leaving the breadcrumbs to get them to the place. You're not just going there, it's there. You're leading them where you want them to go. So part of your strategy is breaking that down. This is what I want them to know. So what are all the key parts that I need to be breadcrumbing to them on this trail, essentially, and offer them the seeds rather than the whole tree. You want them to fit, because they've got egos. They think they're better than you in terms of their professional knowledge. And so you want them to feel like they've come to this on their own conclusion, because it's more powerful when they're able to come to it on their own conclusion. Then it is more powerful. Now, I appreciate it can feel like that's impossible, but if you follow, these steps in building your strategy, then breadcrumbing it for them rather than, like, say, dumping everything on them and saying, here you go, here's everything, and getting them to sort through it, they're going to miss everything. They're going to miss all the important bits. It gets watered down and diluted. So plant seeds, don't give them the whole tree. And the final bit of this section is to translate your emotions into legal terms. So learn what they're looking for legally, as I said, go through their guidance and understand that, but translate what is my experience emotionally and what does that mean. So, and I can share with you the translating narcissistic behaviors for the court. That will give you an idea of how to do that. So it's looking at, so what is gaslighting? I'm not saying any of you would use that, but it's a good example. So gaslighting, we all understand this in this community because we've experienced it and we've spent ages, researching it, and we've become psychologists by default just from this experience. But the court, although they're catching up, they don't really know it. And you can't know it. You can't know a lot of this stuff unless you've really experienced it and you've felt it and you've been on that journey. So how do you translate that? Well, you talk about, it's breaking down the reality that it is, they're presenting a distorted view of reality. And so it's taking those emotional experiences and turning them into a legal context. Again, I can share all the tools, the individual tools to do that with you. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to kind of try and move through this a little bit faster, so I apologize. I always get... I like to give you as much as possible. So turn every allegation into a leverage point. So false allegations are a given in these situations because it fulfills their need to be seen as the victim or the hero. It means that they can garner sympathy. It means that they can discredit you. It means that they can avoid accountability for their own action. It fulfills a myriad of different bonuses for them to make false allegations against you. And again, I talked about this in the false allegations workshop. There's a difference between an allegation and an accusation, but for what we're going to talk about now, I'm going to bulk them all into one. So every time they accuse you of something that is false, the natural human reaction is to defend yourself, to go, whoa, hang on a minute, that didn't happen. That's perfectly normal and natural. But actually, that's partly what they want. They want to lure you in. They want to get your attention. They want to get you involved in a back and forth because they think, one, they're getting your attention. So like the naughty child, they are getting your attention. They're getting supply. But also they know that they can wear you down, and eventually you might just go, you know what, excuse my language, fuck off. And then they can go running to everyone and go, oh, look how awful they are. Look at the language that they use. They can't co-parent with this person. But actually, without showing them any of the build-up to that at all. So every false allegation that is made is use it now as part of your strategy. And I've always spoken to people about this. It becomes part of your strategy. So recognize that defensive mechanism. Because false allegations hit at a core wound within us. They're questioning, you know, are we good enough as a person? Are we honest? You know, it really start to understand what have they really poked here? Why is this hurting so much? And then you can, through therapy, through, you know, journaling, whatever you use to deal with the emotions of this, you can work through that to deal with the core wound, deal with ground zero. But also, when you are aware of that, rather than going on the defense, which again leaves you vulnerable, which we've talked about before, make sure that you are aware. Jessica, could you pop your mute on? Sorry, we keep hearing
you.
It's all right. So when that allegation is made, just be aware of the fact that you want to defend yourself. Now, that's not to say you won't sometimes have to, but what I would suggest is if again, a lot of this depends on your trauma response, whether you're fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, but write it down. Write down what you'd like to say. You know, all of it, all the swears, all the nasty words you want to say about them, everything you want to say. Write it down or type it up. If you're typing it up, make sure it's somewhere that can never get accessed or shared or anything. But just have an outlet for it rather than texting them back, emailing them back. Have an outlet for it, because that energy, that anger, that fear, that shame, whatever it is that it's triggered, it needs an outlet because it'll come out somewhere. Like in that champagne bottle, it will pop at some point. You don't want it popping at the wrong place. So get it out. However you want to do that. If you want to punch a bag, you want to go for a run, scream at the wind, which I found very therapeutic. Just do something that gets that out, but don't go straight into defending yourself, because that leaves you vulnerable. So that's step one when you get that. Step two is start using these. What you'll find, and I do this in evidence trackers, I provide you with the tool to be able to track this, is you'll start to notice that not all the time, but 99% of the time, there will be a trigger that has led to them making this allegation. Now, it might be that you had a great weekend, you know, or something's happened, or, you know, you've asked for a bit more money, or you've asked them for something, or they've asked you for something and you said no. Sure enough, false allegation. When you start to track that and say, after every occasion of them, you know, asking for extra time, or me asking for, you know, some financial assistance with this to, you know, fulfill their financial obligations towards the child, the false allegation is made. Once you start being able to track those patterns, you can then prove in court, this is malicious. This isn't truth. You know, not only is it a false allegation, but this is part of a bigger pattern of them being malicious, of them trying to undermine me and my credibility, but also my relationship with my children, or my relationship with the court, or whatever. But being able to track them is so powerful, because the court needs that. We're shifting towards showing the pattern rather than the defense of the incident itself. So, not saying you don't have to defend yourself, but again, build it as part of your strategy. As there are definitely going to be false allegations. This is what I'm going to do with them. I'm going to start tracking them. And again, I will, I need to write a note of some of these things that I've said I'll share with you. So I will share with you the false allegations workshop, so that you can have a look a bit more, because I talk a bit more about how to respond to them in depth in there. So finally, when it kicks off, because this is the time, this is the under fire bit. When it kicks off, you know, when you're in a court hearing and they suddenly scream out an allegation, or they suddenly change the goalposts. How do you respond to that? So having a flexible strategy, it can be really useful here. So this is where that, having that bigger goal, this is the big strategy, this is a style of play, but actually what's happened is, they made a substitution and it's changed the whole game. How do we adapt to that quickly so that we're not vulnerable? That's what you've got to do. You've got to adapt quickly to this new incident, whatever it is that's happened, whether it be in court, in a report, outside of school, whatever it is. You need to react quickly and adjust your strategy for this new piece of information. Again, a lot of this relies upon you being able to stay calm and think clearly, which I know is difficult, which is again why I always talk about how important it is for you to have that emotional support. So if this happens in court, for example, I would always, if it's a big one, ask for a minute. If you can't have just a minute in the court, just say, could we just step outside? That's a big allegation. I've not heard that before. Could you just give me a minute to just process that? You can ask. Even just asking slows the momentum down, because this is what they do. They're very quick. They want to keep things fast. This is why they'll pile stuff on. When they're stressed, they move quick. And so they will pile things on to just leave you disorientated. So the simple process of just asking for a minute, one, shows that you can be stable. You can be calm in the moment. You recognize, okay, something, I need a minute. That undermines their entire allegations and their entire narrative about you as being unstable and aggressive, and all of whatever it is that they're saying about you, it undermines it, because actually you're able to recognize and show the court, okay, I need to just take a minute. And that's very normal. That's healthy to take that moment. So that would be my advice always, is just to acknowledge it and ask for a moment. That should calm you down straight away, because you're stopping that momentum. Like I say, if you just jump in and try and defend yourself straight away and try and react, your brain will go off on all these tangents. You will make no sense. And again, that adds to their narrative about you. You could get angry. Again, a lot of this depends on you knowing what is your default trauma response. Are you fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? And so when you know that, you know how you're going to react, and you can have a mechanism for that. So if, for example, naturally you go into fight mode. So when someone makes an allegation against you, you naturally want to come back. You naturally want to defend yourself and say, no, hang on a minute, they're just saying this because blah, blah, blah. Recognize that, and then push against a wall or push your hands down on the desk, just something to dispel that energy that's in you. Push the energy into something else, just to make sure that you pushing it out. You are dispelling that fast moving energy that they would use to undermine you even further. If you're in flight, just under the desk, if you're sat in the court, just shake your hands, shake that energy out, shake it out, and then you come back. Freeze, push your feet deep into the floor, grounding you, knowing you're safe in this moment. The earth is underneath you. You are safe. That can just kickstart you into being back in the room. It prevents that dissociation from the moment. It's a sensory feeling. And fawn, just, if you can, place your hand on your heart and just try and take a couple of deep breaths into that. Again, it just kickstarts your nervous system into that. So these are, this is how you kind of stay regulated in those moments. And then for emergencies, again, I'm going to refer you to the false allegations webinar, because I talk about that more. But you need to weigh up in that moment, is this an emergency? Is this something that I need to respond to, and having an emergency strategy alongside your regular strategy. So again, going back to football, someone gets sent off, we're down to 10 men. What's the emergency strategy? That will depend on the position, but you need that emergency strategy. What happens when this goes wrong? How do I adjust to that? So have a separate emergency strategy. Bear in mind your long-term game here. So it might be that whatever's happened doesn't need a response and actually doesn't change the overall strategy at all. And so it's being aware that and being able to make those decisions in a faster time to decide, do I need to shift my strategy into this emergency response? And what does that look like? Or are we still on track? Does my long-term strategy still work? Are we still doing okay? Okay, so that's that.